Hello and welcome to the Manchester is Red podcast. My name is Steven Railston and we're recording this episode on a Monday morning. Not much happened over the weekend regarding Manchester United. Though of course there was big news. Sheikh Jassim pulled out of the running to buy the club, and I'm joined by my colleagues Samuel Luckhurst and Tyrone Marshall to dissect what that means, to look at Sir Jim Ratcliffe being the only one left at the table now and what that could mean going forward. But before we go any further, the pleasantries as usual. How are we, lads?
Not bad, thank you. Not bad. A week off. I'm a psychologist cap on. I still dreamt I was in a press conference and a Manchester United press officer coming up to me and saying how angry he was about the headline in a newspaper that wasn't our newspaper. It was a front page as well, the headline on that. So again, I think if you're an amateur psychologist, it doesn't take a great deal to work out what's going on there in my mind.
Who did United have at the club under Ranić? Was it Sasha Lenz, the psychologist that brought it?
It was.
Maybe we'll get an appointment with him.
Sounds incredibly realistic, that though, Samuel. Yeah. Are you sure it was a dream?
Yeah. It did feel very real anyway. It wasn't a lucid dream.
Did you have any dreams or nightmares, Tyrone, across the international break?
I had a nightmare on Friday when I ended up watching England-Australia by mistake. But yeah, other than that, all good on the sleeping front.
We'll go straight into the takeover news then, gents. I mean, Sheikh Jassim said he was the dream owner for Manchester United, but he's not going to be because he's pulled out of the race. The club was put on the market 11 months ago. It's almost 1 year since it was announced. The Glazers were exploring strategic alternatives, which obviously could include selling it. Rounds of bidding with Sheikh Jassim and Sir Jim Ratcliffe followed. There's not been much since then, Samuel. There's been contrasting updates across the months. Probably not much happening worth reporting on. But this, anyways, for me, feels a bit significant now. We've had Sheikh Jassim pull out, withdraw his bid, and now Ratcliffe's the only one left at the table.
Yes, it's the whole process, the whole story has been a classic case of less is more. There's been a lot of noise at certain times. I remember during a week or two off in June, there was this frenzy online about something that was apparently imminent in regards to Qatar, and it wasn't. It was from some obscure account on social media, which sounds like it's a parody, but apparently that was the case. Fortunately, as I said, I was off at the time. But when we were on the tour in July, we certainly started to get a sense that United were not going to be sold outright. Ty and I spoke to someone who's very, very well connected on Wall Street and that world really, and painted a much clearer picture than anything we'd encountered before in regards to it. And then we spoke to someone quite high ranking at United who stressed again that statement that came out about the strategic review did not make a promise that it was going to be a complete sale, that they were open to investment coming in. And I think a lot of fans, because the top line from that statement was United for sale, which was true at the time, but because of that, I think a lot of fans have always been of the mindset that they were going to get sold. And I think it was as far back as February, I was told that Joel Glazer and Avram Glazer are reluctant sellers, and that stance has hardened over the course of time. And of course, in light of the weekend's events, a lot of supporters are unhappy about Sheikh Jassim's withdrawal. And when you go back to his pitch and that statement that he released on, I think it was February the 16th, it was a compelling pitch. I think for most Manchester United supporters, it ticked every box in terms of making the club debt-free, being 100% sale, taking complete control of the club, doing up Old Trafford, investing in the men's and women's teams, community projects, putting fans at the heart of it as well. I think that was the slogan. The problem for a lot of fans as well was that it would have been a state-owned club if that would have come to pass. And a lot of fans were still opposed to Qatari ownership on ethical grounds. There was a No to Qatar banner that was, I think, in the away end at West Ham and Brighton in May. And I would imagine after what's happened at the weekend that there'll be probably some more form of protests planned. I think given what's going on in the Middle East, that just feels really crass now. and you can't overlook what's going on in the Middle East in relation to United at the moment. Geopolitics, unfortunately, is ubiquitous in football now. Whenever there's a takeover, there's always an element of whataboutery, and of course, this I think it was pretty quick. And after these statements came out in February, and a few of us did our pieces and put our heads above the parapet and pretty much said what we don't think should happen. And I was quite open about it from the start, that I was opposed to Qatari ownership of Manchester United. I didn't like the prospect of both Manchester clubs being owned by states. I think that's unbecoming. I think United in particular as an institution, they've always got to be bigger than that, be better than that, although it was always in the hands of the Glazers. A lot of people were unhappy with that, predictably. And of course, then you'd get the occasional bots coming into your timeline, so I was informed. And there was one man who emailed a number of us journalists on the United beat, and he sent us the same email. It was all about, well, this is greenwashing. So Jim Ratcliffe would be greenwashing because he's a petrochemicals billionaire. Because there's all the talk of sports washing with Qatar, this would be greenwashing. He's a Brexiteer, he lives in Monaco, he moved there soon after becoming knighted. There's always a lot of whataboutery where it concerns the ownership of United, and it's always been quite a heated topic. And there are other things in regards to it that we can't say because it will just, we could do without it, really, frankly, in terms of how incendiary it can be, because it is a fervent topic among United supporters. There will be supporters who are pro-Qatar, there'll be others who are anti it. I think really there is an existing dichotomy in the United fan base because of that. I think it would be exacerbated if these protests were to take place, as I said, because of what's going on in the Middle East. You can't overlook the fact that although it may be moot, the Glazers are Jewish. There are Jewish United supporters who go to games, who I've spoken to, who feel unsafe since what happened in Israel and that massacre, which is just unspeakably sad and unimaginably horrific. And there are also, aspects of Israel's retaliation in Palestine, which you can abhor as well simultaneously without taking sides. But where it's football and where it's geopolitics, it is always tribal, unfortunately. And the nuance kind of gets lost in it. And I suppose with the Qatari element, if a Qatari takeover would have taken place now, which I don't think has really been in the offing for quite some time. I've never had the sense that Sheikh Jassim was the favourite, and I think his momentum was starting to peter out some months ago when it was apparent that the Glazers weren't going to go for a full sale. But had it happened, you can only imagine the outcry when leaders of Hamas, who are the terrorist group behind these barbaric attacks in Israel, are living in Qatar. And there have already been calls for the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak to sanction Qatar because they are giving residency to leaders of Hamas. It's pretty, first and foremost, it's tragic what is happening in the Middle East. And on a much more trivial element in regards to football, it is sad that the game has become that grubby where geopolitics is so rife. And you go back to the 2018 World Cup, the opening game, you've got Gianni Infantino sat between Vladimir Putin and Mohammed bin Salman. When it gets to that extent, you know that the game is up for football, and I suppose you are swimming against the tide in terms of trying to keep it pure, because the pureness ended a long time ago. And I completely get, people have reservations about Sir Jim Ratcliffe's investment in United, but he has played politics. He as Ty said before we came on air, he saw which way the wind was blowing and realised that he wasn't going to get anywhere just trying to buy them outright, because Joel Glazer and Avram Glazer absolutely do not want to sell United. So what's the compromise? And the way he's approached it is a compromise where it looks like it's going to be a 25% minority stake where he gets pretty good control of apparently of the footballing operations. It's almost like the Glazers are the film studio, and they've hired a director who's been given ample creative control with their project. Now, if that's the arrangement that Ratcliffe is in for, and I imagine it would be, because history tells us he is not a bit part player, and his end goal will be to take full ownership of United eventually, whenever that may be. It remains to be seen. But he's not just going to get involved in United just to have a seat in the director's box, watch what's going on and allow other people to make those decisions. He is going to want to have a big say in the running of the club, because you look at his past ventures in sports, that's what he does. And I don't think that's a disastrous scenario for United. I completely agree with...
This scenario to a season ticket holder last season, it would have slapped your hands up for. And I know the Qatar investment, for all the issues that comes attached to it, a lot of fans have wanted it. But if that had never been in the picture, fans would be delighted, surely, with
Ratcliffe coming on board and having a minority stake.
They always needed investment. I mean, Gary Neville has talked too much in general, but at the start of last season, he wasn't talking as much about it. And he said at the outset, I think it was post-Brentford, that the club needed new investment. The cash flows were that low. So that was always going to have to come one way or another. And look, I know there are cons with Ratcliffe, as on a moral standpoint. I don't agree with Brexit. I don't agree with someone getting knighted and then moving over to the tax haven of Monaco. Yeah, there's the greenwashing element that people will abhor as well. But sometimes it really not so much a lesser of two evils, but when it comes to realistic options on the table, he has played the politics there. He is not going to want to fail at Manchester United. He said on the record as well, you can't, I think the quote was something like, the prospect of failing at Manchester United is unimaginable. He does not want to be someone who is tarred with the same brush as the Glazers. And also, if he is, his card is marked by the supporters amid the prospect of him taking full ownership somewhere down the line. He is not going to want to be synonymous with, although he's having to associate with the Glazers, he is going to probably do as much as he can to separate himself from them, which is why one would imagine there will be some very key, tangible changes made on his watch.
In terms of the fan base, I think it's fair to say it would be too simplistic to suggest all match goers wanted Sir Jim Ratcliffe and the online fans, overseas fans wanted Sheikh Jassim. But it's definitely felt like that over the last 11 months or so. In terms of why Qatar have pulled out of this bid then, Ty? I mean, Samuel's just touched upon some of it there, and why Sheikh Jassim is backing out of the race. The words fanciful and outlandish were used for the Glazers' valuation of the club. Sheikh Jassim submitted an offer 2 times the club's market valuation. But there was obviously an element of that and an element of Sir Jim Ratcliffe being a bit more savvy with the way he structured his deal. And that's clearly played into this, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has, I mean, there's a lot of criticism of Sir Jim Ratcliffe floating about online from fans, and I think it's, this isn't now a scenario where it was Qatar or Sir Jim Ratcliffe. Qatar only wanted a full sale, and that wasn't going to happen, and hasn't been a prospect for months. The scenario really was Sir Jim Ratcliffe gets a foot in the door and 25%, or they get investment from a faceless US hedge fund and private equity, which makes matters worse. If anything, this is, on those 2 scenarios, this is the better option. And of course, I get why fans want a full sale only, why that has been a campaign. Every Manchester United fan wants the Glazers out. There is no doubt about that. But it's been clear for some time that they weren't going to go. And yes, the valuation probably is fanciful and outlandish. I think, we never hear from them, so we'll never know, or certainly not in the short term. I think they will be very surprised at the lack of interest they got. And I think Rain will be very surprised and a little bit nervous at what it does for their reputation, to be honest, given how much interest they got in Chelsea. It was Rain doing Chelsea that convinced the Glazers to go with Rain. And, I was told that Rain were telling people early on that this is going to be a doddle, this is going to be an easy full sale. And in the end, the only people they brought to the table were a guy who tried to buy United last summer and Qatar, who've been sniffing around United for 10 years. They didn't bring anyone else to the table.
Why is that then? Is that the infrastructure of the club, where the club finds itself? or just simply the valuation?
Probably the valuation, I guess.
They must have underestimated what the Glazers were.
Yeah, I think so.
For.
And I think the auction element of Chelsea maybe encouraged more people to have a look and have a go in the prospect of getting a deal. And obviously in the end, Todd Boehly did not get a deal, but there's an obvious attraction, I guess, to Chelsea with London as well for people. That can't be overlooked, especially for foreign investors. But, you know, had the Glazers just done a private sale, then the two people that are contacted first would have been Ratcliffe and the Qataris, and that's what they got. But like we say, I think Ratcliffe has played the game in a way, whereas Qatar haven't. Samuel mentioned the pitch before, which was a great pitch, but was also indirectly critical of the Glazers. A lot of it was essentially, we'll do what these lot haven't. And as unpalatable as it is, you've got to remember they're the people you're trying to convince to sell. And I don't think that went down particularly well with the Glazers. And I know Ratcliffe's been hammered. I think he said that the Glazers were nice people, or were...
I think he said
okay
that
people.
The nicest people. I think he called them gentlemen.
Right, okay.
He said he'd like to take Manchester United back to the top as well, which obviously implies
Yeah,
the Glazers
there's always...
have been...
you can't really make a pitch without giving away a little bit of where things have gone wrong. But he has played the game and kept them on side, whereas the Qatari pitch was kind of like, well, you've made a mess of this, so we're going to sort all this out. And you've got to remember that these are the people you're trying to buy the club from, and I don't think that went down particularly well. And you know, as Samuel said this week before, Ratcliffe sensed the mood was changing, and it's not. People it should be remembered that Ratcliffe didn't go into this thinking, I'm going to suck up to the Glazers and do a deal that will suit us all. He started this process wanting to buy them out. He's not done because they wouldn't sell. What he's done is adapt his offer to make sure he's got a foot in the door, and fundamentally that. If that's approved this week, United will be in a better position this Friday than they were last Friday. And I know the Glazers are still there and still about, and that's unpalatable for a lot of fans. But if they weren't going to sell, then the unfortunate reality is no end of protests are going to change that. We've seen that now over 18 years, and it feels like the start. It feels like the beginning of the end, basically. That there is an end game in sight now, whether it's 2 years, 4 years. You know, it depends how the deal's structured, but there is at least now a roadmap to the Glazers going and someone else owning the club. And, you know, as we've said, Jim Ratcliffe isn't buying 25% to have 25% of the voting rights on the next manager or transfer targets or what happens with Old Trafford. He's going to get more than that. He's going to provide better on-the-ground leadership, because it's impossible to provide worse on-the-ground leadership. So there are undoubtedly benefits, and I know that it'll be hard to digest for United fans who wanted a full sale. But if that was never an option, which I think is pretty clear it's not been for a while, then this is better than what could have been the alternative in terms of, like I say, a faceless hedge fund propping up the Glazers and letting them carry on doing what they want.
I know you touched upon it in your opening speech there, and I don't want to make it a political correspondent, Samuel. This is a football podcast, but it is good news that there's not going to be a sports washing project in Manchester, or a second sports washing project, I should say. Same-sex marriage, still illegal in Qatar. There's concerns over human rights conditions, and we saw how hideous the conditions were there during the World Cup. So that can only be a good thing, and as a consequence of Qatar pulling out.
Well, that was always, as I said, I stuck my head above the parapet and did that piece on the day of the first deadline, laying out my reasons why I would be opposed to that happening. It still didn't compromise doing objective reporting after that and checking in with the Qataris and just trying to be as diligent as possible. And this is one of the problems with football now. It's not just tribal in terms of supporters supporting their team, but the demographics. There are so many, and it's so diverse as well, which is positive in one sense, but it also can. There's a tipping point that it gets to very, very quickly with things, with matters like this. I don't think we'll ever get a reasonable explanation from these Qatari cheerleaders online as to why they abhor the prospect of Sir Jim Ratcliffe having a minority stake in United or possibly becoming their owner in the future. Ultimately, Qatar have come to prominence in football in the last 13 years, ever since they got the World Cup in 2010, which was ridiculous. It should never have gone there. Even Sepp Blatter eventually said Qatar should not have got the World Cup. The World Cup last year was brilliant. Probably the best final ever. It was a great spectacle, great stories with Morocco getting to the semi-finals. You could have had great stories at a World Cup anywhere. And let's not forget that in 2018, Russia held it. And what did Russia then do 4 years later? They invaded Ukraine. And 4 years after they had been awarded that World Cup, which they also shouldn't have been awarded, what did they do? They annexed Crimea. You cannot overlook the geopolitics in football. And Qatar have clearly been emboldened to continue their ventures in football since they got the World Cup in 2010. They took over the ownership of PSG, I believe, in 2011. So that happened quite quickly after they were awarded the World Cup. And of course, United would have been the crown jewel in all of Qatar, really. That's what the nation would have been synonymous with had Sheikh Jassim's bid been successful. But I've always been of the mindset that a football club should matter more than just what goes on the pitch, and it's been unpalatable for a lot of United fans what has happened over the last 18 and a half years under the Glazers' occupation. Even though they've had some extremely successful times there during that period, it has always been in spite of the Glazers because, I mean, they treat supporters with contempt. We talk about investing in a football club. They've never invested in it in a financial sense or an emotional sense. There's no goodwill to them from supporters whatsoever. There probably was at one point. I remember a long time ago when United were at their pomp under Ferguson. They were probably Premier League and European champions, and you had a fan had got some stick for going on MUTV and saying, "Love United, don't hate Glazers," and he got a round of applause from all the supporters there. So football is a very fickle game, and I know that world existed. Well, that world did exist because Sir Alex Ferguson was the Manchester United manager, and they were the best team on the planet. You weren't going to get any truculent supporters back then. That said, there have been protests during the whole time of the Glazers' ownership when United have been successful. The green and gold happened when they were champions and they'd reached 2 Champions League finals in a row, and also they were quite well poised up until a point that season to retain the league, but they didn't. And of course, last season they had a successful season, and it was to the soundtrack mainly of anti-Glazer rhetoric. So there has been a principled stance from a lot of supporters, and that they have continued to protest whether the club have been successful or unsuccessful. But I don't think it should ever have come at a cost of just taking anyone who would just chuck money at it. United fans sing about how hollow Chelsea's success is because it has come under Roman Abramovich. If they'd had Qatari ownership, they would not have been able to sing that chant. There'd have probably been a few other chants they'd have had to have ceased singing as well because they'd have been hypocrites.
In terms of the reaction then, Ty, just to wrap up this segment, are you surprised at some of the comments that have been made on social media? I mean, social media is a wacky place at the best of times. But I mean, there's been some people suggest this is the end of Manchester United. How could this have happened? I mean, you look at the club's history, the adversity, it's always been there, overcoming it, the Busby Babes. Just stupid comments really, haven't there? There's been some of those.
I think it's the modern world, isn't it? It's boom or bust. There's no nuance in these decisions now. A lot of fans had set their hearts on a full takeover. A lot of fans had set their hearts on Qatar and a Kylian Mbappe and a multi-billion-pound transfer budget. So, you know, I think that a lot of the reaction was based around that. Some of it will be based around the fact that it's not a full sale. But yeah, you know, there was fairly prominent online United fans and YouTube channels and whatnot on Saturday night declaring it the beginning of the end, and there'll be a serious force again, when in reality this is, as we said, this is a step forward. This is a step in the right direction, and it's not the step everyone wants, but it should start to improve things. And yes, it's probably going to mean more short-term pain for now because they are still there, and like we say, Jim Ratcliffe's only got 25%, but it is a step in the right direction, and I think that's worth bearing in mind, that it should actually eventually lead to something better.
And we'll look at that a bit closer in the second part. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to part 2 of the Manchester is Red podcast. Now, Samuel, as you just said there, wrapping up the first segment, We'll discuss Ratcliffe's bid in a bit more detail for 25%, but as you guys have both said before, it's not just going to be 25%. He's going to sit in the director's box and not have any say. He's going to have some control. We understand over footballing matters to have more control in, say, transfers, first team recruitment, etc. And again, that can only be a good thing considering the last decade of decisions that the Glazers have made and the incompetence at the boardroom level. Having a fresh face and some new ideas can only be a positive.
Well, Ratcliffe did an interview with the Times 4 years ago, and he referred to the dumb money was his quote in regards to United, the way they've operated.
Fred, I think, didn't he?
Yeah, he said you see, he singled out Fred.
Which is, I thought was a bit harsh.
He literally singled out Fred, who, well, in fairness, at that point, it did look like a pretty dumb signing. And the hit rate, as far as recruitment has gone, I'd say maybe, at the end of last season under Ten Hag, it was looking pretty good. It's not now. It's looking iffy. And the key signings they made in the summer, Onana. One question is, why didn't you sign him when he was available on a free when he left Ajax at the time you did? And again, there's a mitigation there. De Gea had a good season, and Ten Hag had De Gea. He had Dean Henderson to choose from as well. Still, so was a goalkeeper pressing matter? No, but then, when a year down the line you spend best part of £50 million on this goalkeeper and then he has the start that he's had, more questions are going to be asked, even though it's a rite of passage, it feels like for most United number ones to have a pretty poor start. De Gea, in terms of the goals he's conceded after the same number of games as Onana, I think it's 9 identical, if not the same. Mason Mount looks a questionable signing, and already you wonder if that's a long road back for him, just because other number 7s before him, the real duds, Di Maria, Depay, Cavani, who else? I'm missing 1 or 2 here, I think. But players of that ilk, they actually started better for United than Mason Mount has. Rasmus Højlund as well. United said they got their number 1 target. They didn't. Their number 1 target would have been Harry Kane, and they didn't go anywhere near him in the end because they've not got the financial muscle and they didn't want to deal with Daniel Levy. So there will be... that even though they got those 3 players in before August pretty much, which is pretty good going still, there's still this caveat with each one that Ratcliffe, I suspect, will take a dim view of. And it will be interesting to see what changes are made, if there are any made. I think there have to be anyway. I think if he's coming in, he's going to want to oversee tangible change. You look at what Nice, who are owned by Ineos, they're second in Liga at the moment, still early days, they're above PSG, but they hired a new chief executive and a new sporting director last year, and they've revamped their recruitment strategy. They seem to be just stockpiling Premier League rejects like Ross Barkley, Kasper Schmeichel, Aaron Ramsey, and they've got rid of them. They've gone for a younger squad. It's started to pay dividends already. They're second in the table behind Monaco. And when you look at Richard Arnold, who came into United in 2007, no 2 ways about it, he's a Glazer acolyte. He's a Glazer man. And although the Glazers are still there, you would imagine Ratcliffe will look at that and think, well, I've hired a new chief executive at Nice. Maybe it's time that we hired a new one at United. I think John Murtough is probably vulnerable as well, even though Ratcliffe came out with that comment about dumb money in 2019, and Murtough was made football director in March 2021. He has been at United for 10 years and he's been involved heavily in recruitment. Before he took the football director role, he'd be meeting Alexis Sanchez at Manchester Airport and chaperoning him to Carrington for his medical. I mean, he should have smashed the piano up, I think, really, rather than putting it out for him. I think there are other figures at the club. Ellie Norman, who, what's her role again? It's like head of comms or something like that. And she arrived last year. She's based in the south, and you rarely see her. And she certainly doesn't communicate very often with us guys who are covering the club, which is strange for a communications officer. And there are others who've been hired on the Glazers' watch who have been keeping their powder dry. Probably in the hope, in some ways, that the Glazers might stick around, but I think they're on thin ice. And look, I think since Arnold's been made chief executive, he has cultivated a more autonomous culture so that the heads of departments can run them the way they want to and take leadership and take ownership of those those departments as well. Whereas Ed Woodward was, he was spinning plates. He was trying to do the commercial stuff. He was trying to do the football stuff. It didn't work, and he was a disaster. He was a specialist in failure, as the banner said that time. But still, I think mud does stick, and the way the Mason Greenwood situation was dealt with, I think that not so much the honeymoon period with Arnold, but he has suffered reputational damage as a consequence of that, and United cannot tolerate such bad reputational damage. I mean, they've had Greenwood, and I think the fallout from that, the way they dealt with it in terms of what they were informing us, the tone they struck was completely wrong. The Anthony situation as well, I think they've handled that better. And there's, again, in terms of the nuance of it, where he's not been arrested or detained, that's why they've brought him back into the squad. But some of the things Ten Hag was saying about him in press conferences were just not publishable because they were so inaccurate. So you have to raise questions about that. Ten Hag absolutely should be backed. I don't think anyone in the media or the press have even floated the possibility that he should be sacked whatsoever. And Ratcliffe has got to, provided he comes in sooner rather than later, I think there's got to be backing for him. But there's certainly a lot of departments where you look at it and you think that is not in ship shape. That could do with change.
Does it not have the potential to upset the apple cart a bit, though, Tyrone? Because if you look at Ten Hag's signings, every single one of them have got his fingerprints on. We've talked about this Dutch pedigree that he likes and his former players that he likes to bring in. And we've also talked about the need for aligned recruitment, long-term plan, a vision, something sustainable. But if that comes in, right, if Ratcliffe comes in and installs that, surely that's going to contrast to what Ten Hag wants, to an extent. You'd like to think Ten Hag could operate within that framework. But if he's had 2 years of getting everything he wants, to an extent, he didn't get Harry Kane or these major signings, but a big influence on these names. And then Ratcliffe comes in and goes, hang on a minute, I'd like you to operate like this. Could that potentially upset the apple cart a bit?
No, I don't think so. I think that contrast exists at every football club, really. The manager wants to win tomorrow. The owners want to win tomorrow and look at what comes next. And long term, they should be able to work together for that. At Liverpool under Klopp, when it started out, I guess that was one where they both looked in vision in terms of building for the future. But they ended up with an ageing squad, certainly, but did win in that time frame. You look at Chelsea now, they're clearly looking to the future and have probably got a manager who fits that. But I don't think there's necessarily going to be an issue there, and I don't think it's realistic for Manchester United to look into the future too much. It's too simplistic to say United should have signed Caicedo from Ecuador. They should sign this player first, that player first, because it's totally different. Caicedo went into Brighton and was given time to develop and time to learn his trade. You just don't get that at Man United. Caicedo wouldn't have got in the United team to start off with and might never have got in the United team and might have been sold for £10 million. It's a reality for the big clubs that they can't operate like that. It's very easy to point at Brighton and Brentford and say, this is what you need to be doing. But they are doing that to be successful. For Brighton or Brentford, that is not success for Manchester United. Success for Manchester United is winning and winning now, this season and next season. And of course, you need to have an eye on the future as well as the present. And I think we've seen that more this summer. I said a lot on this podcast last year that my biggest reservation with Kane was his age and that it was an ageing squad and an ageing spine. That has changed this year with De Gea going and Onana coming in, with Mason Mount coming in, with Højlund as the striker coming in. You only have to look at Casemiro this season to realise that if they'd assigned Kane, you have that ageing profile of a team, and very quickly it can just go like that and go wrong, and players can start declining. So, of course, you need an eye on both, but football managers at the level of Ten Hag and people operating at that level should be able to do both. And I think, to a degree, we're seeing that now with United, in that there's a squad there that should be capable of winning things, really. Not the title, maybe, at the moment. It clearly needs more in terms of that. And I guess Højlund is an example of it. He's a signing kind of for the future as well as the present. But in the present, he's not enough for United to win the league. That development is 2 or 3 years down the line, but I think the two should be able to work together. Really, I don't think it needs to cause friction. But the biggest issue, if they were to look at John Murtaugh's role, say, the biggest issue for John Murtaugh is that he's football director, yet the sense is that Ten Hag just gets what he wants, because as we've said, the signings all fit a profile. It's not great for Ten Hag that he's had to answer questions about the involvement of his own agent. He's signed, half the players maybe that he's worked with or that he knows.
Kevin Voss FC.
Yeah, Keys Voss.
Yeah.
Kevin Voss.
Kevin
That's
Voss.
the council estate version of Keys Voss. Kevin Voss. Jeez, I apologise to anyone who's called Kevin that's listening to this podcast. There's nothing wrong with that name.
Yeah, so it's not great Ten Hag's had to answer those questions, and there is a sense, if the recruitment starts to look more negative, that's going to reflect badly on Murtaugh, because there's a sense that he's just kind of given Ten Hag what he wants, when the job of a football director is probably to manage what the manager wants and give him a little bit of that, but also say, right, well, this is the target we're going for here, rather than this player that you want and
I think there was only one player I can think of that United outright vetoed a move for that Ten Hag recommended, which was Hakim.
No?
Well, they bid for Arnautovic. They just withdrew because it was the fan backlash. It was Hakim Ziyech, who is about as Ten Hag a player as you get, in that he played under him at Ajax, and nobody, let's face it, outside the Netherlands, outside Morocco, not many people had heard of Hakim Ziyech. And I was told at the time that United did their due diligence on him and they got feedback, and the feedback was unflattering, speaking to people who knew him. I was thinking, well, you've got the manager there who's managed him. You're not just going off his say-so. So that is the proof that they don't just always go on Ten Hag's say-so. But that's a rarity. I think the recruitment department last year had, again, pushed for Pau Torres as the left-footed centre-back, and Ten Hag was like, no, I want Lisandro Martinez. And of course, United signed Martinez, which nobody has complained about whatsoever, really.
Obviously, you said Ten Hag works very closely with John Murtaugh, but is it too early to speculate who could maybe be brought in a sporting director, football director role? There's been names, Michael Edwards at Liverpool, Ty, you've mentioned, he's very sought after, he's got a big reputation. Paul Mitchell is another name who's been linked, he's been at Old Trafford.
And he lives in Monaco, I think.
There you go. So is that too early, or...?
I don't think it's too early. They need to be looking for best in class. The dynamic there is fascinating, because Ineos have a sporting director who's Sir Dave Brailsford. Now, the prospect of him having... He was with Ratcliffe when they went to Old Trafford in March. The prospect of him, overseeing football matters with Manchester United, okay, with Nice are doing quite well, but Nice, they are a pretty borderline provincial club in Liga with very little history. Compared to Manchester United, the scrutiny is going to be a fraction of that. And Brailsford is... he's a polarising figure in that he had great success. His forte is cycling. With Team Sky, when he was the team principal, when they were winning the Tour de France year after year after year, and also with British cycling, when they were cleaning it up at the 2012 Olympics in London and the Olympics beforehand as well, when they became like probably the world powerhouse in cycling. But there was the doping controversy where you had Dr. Richard Freeman struck off the medical register because he handled banned substances.
Well, that'll be good for all the injuries, won't it? Anyways.
Well,
that's a joke. That's a joke.
You think of Dave Brailsford, and there's the pros of him overseeing this extremely successful time. There's the doping controversy with what happened to Dr. Richard Freeman, and also the use of therapeutic use exemptions that Team Sky used. Bradley Wiggins used one before he won the Tour in 2012. So ethically, that should concern some people. Brailsford is, it was interesting reading David Walsh's column in the Sunday Times yesterday. David Walsh, he obviously exposed Lance Armstrong, and then I think it was seen as quite ironic that he was commissioned to do a book on Team Sky. He did, and then he felt like he'd been duped. I think he even said a few years ago that Wiggins' Tour de France win should have an asterisk against it. And he was very, very critical in this lacerating piece on Brailsford on Sunday, where with the Ineos Grenadiers, who that's the name of Team Sky now, he pretty much said they were spent force, and it's all because of Brailsford who's dropped the ball. So again, there's although that he will not be the Manchester United director of football, there'll be someone. Well, unless it's Mertens, still there'll be someone in that position who's not Brailsford. That person would report into Brailsford. So it's interesting to see what will happen there, because I wonder what input is a guy who was at the Manchester Velodrome a few years ago. How's he going to be the guy to transform Manchester United into a title-winning side again, or Champions League winners in the near future? There's been a little bit of recent success with Nice, but I don't think any United fan will care really what's going on at Nice. I think it's more the fact that Nice have made key changes with the chief executive and the new sporting director coming in. I think the sporting director came from Lens, who of course qualified for the Champions League this season and beat Arsenal the other week. So it was more those hires that have been behind their recent fillip rather than Brailsford's input necessarily.
I once went on a school trip to Lens, and we were only there for 24 hours. We got the bus down all the way from the northeast of England to bloody Lens on a bus. Can you imagine what that was like? I don't know why I thought that was a good idea.
You were in Lens for what, 2 hours, and on the bus
literally,
for
it was like
10
5
hours.
I did get a Lens t-shirt though, a football shirt. I got a name on the back. I can't remember who.
We had those day trips as well, but obviously we were going in from Kent, which is across the channel.
Close.
So
You're basically in France at that point.
Not far off.
Are there any more concerns with Ratcliffe's bid then, Tyrone? I mean, Samuel's just kind of touched upon them there, and he's said he doesn't really think his record at Nice is that significant. But when you look into it a bit closer as time at Nice, it looks like they've been learning on the job. I think it's fair to say. And will that help him at United because he's already made his mistakes?
I think the expectations are very different across both. But his heart is clearly in the right place. As much as there's all this criticism that he's not a United fan, he's a Chelsea season ticket holder and whatnot. His heart is on the right place in terms of he is from Manchester. There is clearly an affinity with United there. And he does have this passion for sport. A decade ago, no one had heard of Sir Jim Ratcliffe. He was Britain's richest man, or one of Britain's richest men, and no one knew who he was. People know who he is now, and he's got this profile because of the sporting investments. Team Sky, Nice, sponsoring Mercedes, Formula One team, Ben Ainsley in the America's Cup, and all of this stuff is supposedly being driven by Sir Jim Ratcliffe because he's a billionaire who wants to get involved in sport now and have fun, and it's brought him this profile. And I think he's said in one of his interviews with the Times that he's got, it's a passion for sport. He's doing things that he's got a passion for now, which is a good place to be. And I guess if you're a billionaire, it'd be nice to be able to do that. So the obvious difference between him and the Glazers is that he cares, and we know that they don't really. So I think the concerns are around the minority ownership, what comes next. One, by no longer being this recluse that he was 10, 15 years ago, he's got this public profile now. He's done lots of interviews. When he came to Old Trafford, it was no coincidence that the cameras were there to greet him back in March. He's got this more public profile. One of the first things he should be doing when the deal's ratified by the board is speaking through whichever medium he chooses, but explaining how it's going to work, how he sees it going forward, and explaining what he can. There's an obvious lesson to learn from the Glazers in terms of communication. And I think if fans heard from him, if they got a sense of that roadmap of where he sees it going and what influence he can have, then some of those concerns may be quelled. But there is, the concerns for now are fairly obvious that the Glazers still own a large chunk of this football club, and Ratcliffe is a minority stakeholder. So that's, until we know the intricacies of how it's going to work, that's where the concern lies.
Last question then, Tyrone. Who dresses better, Sir Jim Ratcliffe or Samuel Luckhurst?
It's a dreadful question.
Well, from what I've seen of Sir Jim Ratcliffe, Samuel's smart, isn't he? He goes for the suits.
I see Sir Jim in a few
I think
suits,
Ratcliffe's
yeah.
a dresser down, isn't he?
Okay, fair enough. A bit more casual. He looked smart when he went to Old Trafford with.
He did. Well, Samuel always looks smart when he goes to Old Trafford, to be fair. So
sometimes
you should take some pages out of his book, I think, Tyrone. Anyways, that's it for part 2. We'll be back in a moment for part 3. Welcome back to part 3 of the Manchester is Red podcast, and I'm sure you'd be relieved to hear we're not going to talk about fashion anymore. Samuel, priorities for Ratcliffe then, coming into the club. I think we talked about this, I forgot, maybe 6 months ago.
I thought you were going to say 6 minutes ago.
Just repeating ourselves over and over again. No, but if you had to narrow it down, I remember asking you guys, like, narrow it down to 5 priorities. Well, what is the most pressing matters? You've got the redevelopment of Old Trafford, that's huge. The roof is continuing to leak, that needs to be addressed. First team recruitment we've talked about. The training ground, it has been improved. There have been investment at Carrington, but it could be better. What would you say would be on the top of Ratcliffe's agenda coming into the club?
I suspect from his perspective, it's to have a winning team. I still think the stadium should take precedence because...
What would your reaction be if he comes in and says, look, we want that winning team, and we're going to put the redevelopment of Old Trafford on the back burner?
I think that would be a mistake. I don't think you can... I think fans are sick and tired of hearing that. I mean, the cat was let out of the bag a few years ago when, just before I think it was the April 2019 derby, and you had that waterfall gushing down from the Stretford end roof. And the amazing thing was, in the fans forum the following year, when the guy spoke about it, like the stadium manager or whatever it was, he actually referenced the wrong roof. He was going on about another roof, I think at the other end of the ground, and that one didn't have a leak that night. And when I saw this clip, I tweeted like how just what a dreadful
symbolic,
state it
isn't
was.
it, really, of the Glazers ownership?
It's always been an easy intro, really. And the director of comms at the time came out in the press box like a bit, but he had a measured way about it, and like just trying to take. He took umbrage with it effectively, and I just said, look, this was 3 days after they got trounced 4-0 by Everton at Goodison Park. I said, look, this is going on, that's going on. It's, frankly, it's a shit show, really. And he said, well, the fans they want new signs, they want a new stadium, they can't have it both ways. And I thought, that's it. They're never going to get a new stadium and also have a team that has had sufficient investment on the watch of the current owners, which just confirmed everything that most, if not everyone, had suspected for a long time. Now, with somebody new coming in, it does raise the question of whether that is possible. And I know with the transfer market now, there are financial fair play matters which United go on about ad nauseum, but at least they are abiding by that, and they're quite keen as well to point out that they will comply with financial fair play matters, unlike the other lot in Manchester who've got 115 charges against them from the Premier League. But the stadium, it was best in class until about 15 years ago, maybe in fact longer than that. And the fact that it's not going to be a stadium for the Euros in 2028 is an embarrassment, no matter how the club tried to spin it that that we're not sure what revamp will happen, and there's still uncertainty over that, and that's why we decided not to go in for it. It's embarrassing that the biggest club stadium in the country, and probably the most famous club stadium in the country, is not going to be hosting European Championship matches. That is a sad indictment on the running of Manchester United and the neglect that's been allowed to happen there. And I get it that there'll be concerns from supporters, possibly supporters who don't necessarily go to Old Trafford very often, that they'll look at Arsenal, what happened when they moved to the Emirates Stadium, and they moved there in 2006, and then they didn't win a trophy until 2014, I think it was, when they won the FA Cup. And everybody knew that the cost of the Emirates Stadium had impacted their success on the pitch. Tottenham have got possibly the best football stadium in the world. They've still not won anything since the 2008 League Cup. They're doing very well at the moment. I still suspect that there will come a point where, because of it's quite a thin squad and whatnot, that they will fall away, and it wouldn't surprise me whatsoever if they have another trophyless season. They've already come out of the League Cup. They've not got European football. I don't think anybody expects them to win the Premier League, so it's pretty much all on the FA Cup, and chances are there'll be a couple of other teams, big hitters, who'll win that ahead of them. So I get the concern in that I get the argument that you've got to prioritise the team. It's always got to be the team, and that has been the way United have operated not pre and post Ferguson, but during Ferguson's time under the Glazers, and also since Ferguson left. There's been huge investment in the squad. Nobody I know there's a lot of nuance to it, and there have been summers where the spending plummeted and there were serious issues with that, particularly in 2018, when you really realised that something was fundamentally wrong between manager and the hierarchy at the club. But they have, Richard Arnold said it best, he said they burned through $1 billion in cash, and they have done. And they're going to have to be very careful the way they spend it now because of the sustainability, profitability rules from the Premier League and FFP with UEFA as well. And it's good that United will comply with that, but they have got to start spending in better ways, because already this summer they got a bit of stick over the Mount deal. I thought that was a bit harsh. I think overall £60 million, given his profile, I thought that was fair, even though I didn't think they should have gone for
spent including add-ons. He spent over $400 million now during his reign.
Yeah, he's had unprecedented backing at United, and as I said earlier, his hit rate in recruitment, and this is his team. Let's face it. I mean, there've been a lot of desperate attempts to try and absolve him of blame for their start to the season. He is heavily accountable for it. And it's easy just to do a Gary Neville and blame the Glazers after they've got thumped at home by Brighton, but the Glazers are not playing Scott McTominay on the right of the midfield diamond and trying to implement a new formation on the fly. Ten Hag has to take accountability for that. But I still think United need to present themselves as a different image to what they are under the Glazers. And I think that's why it's beneficial for Ratcliffe that if you do up Old Trafford and it feels like a new stadium, you go to it and it's all about, it's got to be like a new era. And maybe that won't be possible while he's still, I suppose the cynical phrase would be in cahoots with the Glazers, because he's going to be a minority stakeholder. But I just we go to the stadium twice a month, 3 times a month, whatever it is, and you feel sorry for the supporters who pay an awful lot of money, and it's not good enough. It still has that aura, and I think most football grounds have that aura. Even Selhurst Park, when you go out in the open there, you really do relish the pureness of it because it's a football ground. I think you'll always have that buzz of stepping out into a football ground and out into the open. And Old Trafford is still a place that people gape at when they come up to their seat or emerge from the tunnel, and that's because of the history of the place. But it's been neglected, and they've got to get that in ship shape. They've got to present a new image of Manchester United, and I think at times the squad will take care of itself in a way. I know that sounds a bit daft because they've had some pretty dreadful seasons over the last 10 years, but even in the worst season in decades under Solskjaer and Rangnick, the season only really technically ended in early May. That was the point where they couldn't get the top 4 any longer. So they still had, even that dreadful team still had something to play for, even though a lot of them had checked out. They still had something to play for going into May, which is surreal, but that was the reality.
Still finished with West Ham that season. Do you remember me telling you that story about the better placed, about United to finish with West Ham the following season? I went, if Manchester United can finish with West Ham in the worst season for decades,
the best West Ham team in decades, the
there
worst
you
United
go, when you put
team.
it like that.
Exactly.
So it was easy money, really, wasn't it?
It was for you, yeah.
Do you feel as strongly as Samuel about that matter than Tyrone, the stadium being such a priority? Because I guess it could be argued, as Samuel said, if the team's winning and the success on the pitch, are people going to really notice that much? Are people going to really care? Because it has become quite symbolic of the Glazers' reign. I mean, we've talked about the leaking roof. Even you talked about the mix zone last week. It's an awful mix zone. It's not a proper mix zone, is it? Compared to,
it's not a mix zone.
Well, there you go. So, and I mean, that's small fry really, because that's what we're talking about. That as journalists, and the fan experience obviously counts more. But there's obviously huge concerns with the stadium.
Yeah, there is. I mean, I would say the priority is both. This is Manchester United. Why can't it be both? I think you can build a successful team while renovating the stadium as well. I don't think it has to be one or the other. I think the stadium is clearly a big priority, and that should start as soon as possible. From what we're told, there is a range of options ready to go as soon as they make a decision. So let's make a decision and get on with it. But that can go hand in hand with investing on the pitch, and and building a team. For me, I don't really see why it has to be one or the other. But we spoke about it on Friday's podcast. I think it was me and Rich on Friday. But as Samuel said, the whole 2028 thing is disastrous for United. Really, I painted an example then of a supporter that could come to Manchester for Euro 2028 and they'd stay at their new hotel on site at the Etihad. They go to a game at the Etihad. They do the tourist skywalk at the Etihad. They go to a gig at the Etihad at the Co-op Arena, of which City are the largest stakeholders.
What's Manchester City's stadium called?
They fly in with Etihad.
Etihad.
But that just shows that's a stadium that's got so many attractions. That's got everything. You could come to a game there for Euro 2028, and like I say, do a tourist attraction, do a gig, stay at the hotel, City are making money off all of that. And they're developing the stadium at the moment and invested in the team in the summer. They've got a £300 million redevelopment, which will include a fan zone for 3,000 supporters. So they have got every box ticked there, and that's what United need to aspire to. And United, that Old Trafford is a huge footprint. United could do all of that. They just don't want to under the Glazers. They just haven't been bothered because it involves spending money. They've shown no interest in it. So they could achieve that. And the fact that they basically had to say, we can't guarantee that the roof won't be leaking in 2028, so we can't have a European Championship game, is embarrassing for Manchester United. And it shows, I read this last week, it shows two clubs in Manchester going in opposite directions, and that's the trend that needs to be reversed. And clearly the stadium is a huge part of that. Somebody mentioned the fans forum before. There was a fans forum again last week, and once again the roof leaking was a part of it. That's 5 years on. They're still talking about we're looking at how to fix a leaking roof.
I mean, I was told as soon as leaks are identified, they're fixed immediately. And I mean, that's a bit dubious, isn't it, really, when you saw all the videos and stuff that have emerged over the years.
I think another reason why there needs to be tangible change, when we spoke to some people at the club and on the tour, and one of our colleagues actually said, are you not worried what they're doing up the road, like expanding the stadium? And they didn't seem worried. And that alone is the reason why you need fundamental change at the club.
We talked about the priorities. I mean, it's such a simple thing to do, but communication has to be up there, doesn't it, on the top of the agenda, because there's been such a lack of communication, and that's a huge frustration for supporters. It's such a simple thing, but it means a lot.
Yeah, well, if this is ratified this week, Ratcliffe has got to come out quite quickly and address key questions, whether that's through the club, which they'll be restricted in terms of what they ask him. So I think sometimes those exercises are pretty pointless. I think he needs to be as clear and transparent as possible, and just arrange for a rendezvous or a sit down where he will be asked every relevant key question that fans would want to ask him, and answer it as cogently as possible, so he can outline his clear vision for United, because I don't think a press release will just suffice. And as Ty said, he has done a fair few interviews in recent years about sporting ventures. Rereading Matt Dickinson's interview with him 4 years ago, I think one of the first paragraphs notes that how happy he was to do this interview because it was about sport. It wasn't about fracking, which is obviously another topic of discussion that I don't think any of us are experts on, but provokes outcry from a lot of members of the public. So he's clearly quite comfortable speaking about football. Those pictures of him at Old Trafford in March, they're the only pictures on file of Sir Jim Ratcliffe at Old Trafford. It's like, how many times have you been to Old Trafford? How regular match goer were you? He said he was at Camp Nou for the Champions League final in '99, but
in the Barcelona end, apparently, or in a Barcelona shirt.
he's going to have to connect with match goers, and it's an easy win for him. It's an open goal. He was born in Failsworth. Greater Manchester United fan, seeking to become the owner of the club. It's a pretty good story if it all comes together, but I suspect there are a few more obstacles yet to navigate.
If he shows that he cares, it can only go down well. It's such a simple thing, but it goes a long way. It does. Thank you very much for your time, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
And thanks to listeners as usual. I'm always told to plug our socials, so head across to TikTok. Samuel, you're a TikTok man? I asked Tyrone last
I
week.
heard this on last week's podcast.
Are you a TikTok man?
Unsurprisingly, I'm not. No, my dad is, unbelievably. He's on it. I pray that he's not.
Doing dances and whatnot. And,
Jesus.
yeah. Obviously, YouTube channel as well, ticking across nicely with the subscribers. But we'll be back to look ahead to the weekend where Manchester United are playing Sheffield United at Bramall Lane. Take care.